Did you know that Washington State is the capital of lost sunglasses? That's based on a Seattle Times article from 1993 that said that residents of Seattle bought 50% more sunglasses per capita than anywhere else in the country. Nobody knows if that's true or not, but we repeat it like it is. And I would have to say that based on my personal experience, I think that's true. In the 16 plus years that we have lived in Washington, I have owned more sunglasses than any place that I have ever lived before, because essentially you take them off in October and you don't need them again until somewhere between April and July, and you lose them. And then for me, it's not just that I lose a pair between October and April. I lose several pairs during the summer too. And the way that I try to combat this is that I have 2 or 3 places where I leave my sunglasses. Because if I only leave them in 2 or 3 places, I always know where they are. But with an amazing regularity, I still can't find them. And so I will start searching high and low. I look in my car, and they're not where they're supposed to be. I look in the glove compartment, which they never are in. I look underneath the seat, which is where they end up sometimes if I take a corner too fast. If they're not there, I look in the drawer in my nightstand, which I never keep them there. And I look sometimes on the shelf in the closet. I've even checked the freezer before because you just never know. And I finally get to the point where I'm like, I have no idea what I have done with my sunglasses. And I say to my wife, I cannot find my sunglasses. I don't know where they are. And she says, there they are. And you know, the crazy thing is, they were there the whole time. I just didn't see them. And that is really at the core of what we're going to talk about this morning. The fact that stuff can be happening right in front of us, and we can totally miss it. So I'm going to read a story which for many of you will be familiar. For some, it is brand new. It's the story of the Emmaus Road. The thing to keep in mind is that this happens on Easter. This is just a couple of hours later after the disciples discovered that the tomb is empty. Now, the same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what's more, it's the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were open, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It's true, the Lord is risen, and he's appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. So last week on Easter Sunday, we left the story with Peter sitting there wondering what in the world had happened. And now we pick up the story with how this is affecting the rest of the disciples. So this is a couple of them. There's more than two. And they're headed to a little village named Emmaus. We don't really know why. It could be because everybody's just so depressed they've given up and they're like, let's go home. Another good option is just that there's a party in Jerusalem and there's no hotel openings, and so they had to take, the Holiday Inn in Emmaus, so they're headed over there. So either one of those could be true, but what's happening on the way is they're kind of depressed. And they're basically going over their hopes and their dreams of what might have happened and looking at what did happen. They're trying to figure this thing out. They're talking with each other. As they talk and discuss these things, Jesus comes up and he walks along with them. But in one of the very first of the weird parts of this story, they were kept from recognizing him. Now, if you're walking along and someone comes up next to you that you know, how do you not know them? I mean, how do they miss Jesus? He's right in front of them. Maybe they don't expect him because he's dead. Maybe they aren't looking for him because, see above, he's dead. Maybe because he doesn't look like what they thought he was going to look like. But it says they were kept from recognizing him. The Greek is much more poetic. The Greek says their eyes were held back. And I love that because it's like their eyes couldn't get quite far enough to be able to see. They were held back just a little bit, so they didn't quite see what was going on. So, some people think that this might have been Satan blinding their eyes. I don't know. I think to me it sounds much more like God had this purpose in keeping them not quite able to see so that he could take the time to explain the whole thing to them. Because if all of a sudden Jesus pops up next to them, who, see above, was dead, all they're going to do is go, oh my gosh, he's alive, and they're not going to listen to anything else. So I think he just takes this time to kind of walk through everything. The clear teaching of the story is that they weren't seeing what was right in front of them. And if you read the Gospels carefully, this is not new in the story. The disciples spend most of the 3 years with Jesus not quite understanding what is going on. But what is happening all the time is that the entire time that they knew Jesus, the entire time after the resurrection, this whole day, the entire time that they are walking to Emmaus, God is at work. But it's just beyond their experience, just a little bit further that they could see, and so they miss it. So that's what's happening here. And so when Jesus asks them what was going on, they tell everything that everybody knows. They just tell the public knowledge. If you were in Jerusalem, you could have recited these facts. What they miss is everything that Jesus had said. What they miss is everything that Jesus had taught them. They say, well, Jesus of Nazareth, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people, but we had hoped that he was going to be the one who's going to redeem Israel. So at least they give him a title. They say he's a prophet. They kind of have a frame of reference for that. We know what a prophet looks like, some dude who talks for God, and that's what he was. But we had such high dreams and expectations that he might be more than that. And he didn't turn out to be how we had hoped. And now there's these stories. They say that he's raised from the dead, but we haven't seen the body. We're really not sure what to think. And so we're confused, and they just lose all hope. That comes through just loud and clear. We had hoped that Jesus would act like this. We had some expectations we hoped that Jesus would do for us, and he didn't. And so now we're disappointed, and our disappointment has led to hopelessness. And they weren't the only ones. There is a bunch of people in Jerusalem that are disappointed that day. You've got these two, plus however many else were there, and their hope was that Jesus was going to redeem Israel. So what does redeem Israel mean? It's kind of a loaded term for them. It has to do with spirituality. It has to do with governance. It has to do with revival. Primarily when they talk about being redeemed, they mean being returned from exile. I mean, in their minds, they remember being slaves in Egypt. In their minds, they remember being captives in Babylon. And they recognize that this was God's punishment for their sins. And so to be redeemed is to be brought back from that. And now they're in their own land, but they've got these Roman oppressors. To be redeemed is to have the punishment for their sin, canceled and returned from the exile. So in this case, it means no more Roman Empire in their land. But it also means a spiritual revival, that people would return to God and that they'd be liberated from the oppression not only of Rome, but of their own sin and all that. And what Jesus didn't look like what they expected it to look like. So therefore, because it didn't look like what they expected, they assumed that it didn't work. And because it didn't work, they didn't have hope anymore. But no disciple was as disappointed as Judas was. Judas was the most disappointed of all because Judas had the same high hopes that Jesus would overthrow Rome, throw off the oppressors, people would come back to God and reestablish the Davidic monarchy, but to the nth degree. I mean, Judas was crazy radical. In fact, we think of him as Judas Iscariot, as if Iscariot was his last name. Iscariot is not his last name. Iscariot means, ot is plural, he's a Sicarii. Sicarii is his political party. He's Judas the Sicarii. The Sicarii were assassins. A sicar is a small knife. And this political party would go and come up behind Roman officials or people that would work for Rome and would kill them with their knives. And so Judas, this is his political party. He belongs to a group of assassins who want to overthrow Rome. And this is why Judas gets so excited about Jesus. Because it looks like that's what Jesus' mission is too. And that's why Judas betrays Jesus. Because Judas realizes that's not what Jesus is going to do. And that's why he sells him out. Because Judas has a political agenda and Jesus isn't going to help anymore. Now, to his credit, Judas eventually figures out he's wrong. A little bit too late. And then there's the rest of the disciples, and they're just wandering around. They don't know what's going on because they didn't think this whole thing was going to end in Jesus' death. And they now have no frame of reference. So there's all this disappointment because somehow in all of this, they have missed what Jesus said about himself. They tell the story that everybody knows, but they leave out what Jesus actually said about himself and what he was doing. And I find that incredibly interesting. How do you miss that? If you've been hanging out with Jesus for 3 years and he's pretty much been talking your ear off for 3 years and pretty much demonstrating what the kingdom of God looks like, how do you miss that? And yet they do. They've somehow replaced Jesus with their hopes and their dreams and their preferences and their expectations. Or maybe they've just convinced themselves that what they want is what Jesus wants. And I love what Tim Mackey said about this passage. He said, when we impose our agenda on Jesus, he remains invisible. When we submit ourselves to Jesus' upside-down kingdom, epitomized by the cross, then we can experience the real Jesus. When we take Jesus on his terms, then we see who he really is. So Jesus listens to them as they kind of go through their exercises in missing the point. And when they get to the end of this, he says, how are you missing this? Which implies they should have been able to see it. And maybe that's why their eyes are held back, so that Jesus can walk them through it and they won't miss it this time. And so he goes through the scripture. He goes through the Bible that they have from the beginning of the end of it. He says, you guys are idiots. You're slow to believe. I've taught you this thing. Didn't the Messiah have to suffer before he entered his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explains to them what it was said in the scriptures concerning himself. It's like, you guys, it's all there. And ultimately, I think what is happening is that we see that God could have overthrown the Romans, or he could defeat the power of sin and death and reclaim the entire universe for himself. He chose the latter. The people would have settled for the former. But the thing is, the power is in who Jesus really is, not in the God we make for ourselves. And then another unusual thing that happens in the story, verse 30. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" In other words, how did we miss this? Finally, their eyes were opened. Jesus was revealed through the sacrament, because he's basically sharing the Lord's Supper with them. And Jesus was revealed to them when the word was being opened to them. That was when they saw who Jesus really was, not just who they had hoped he would be, or the God that they had constructed in their own image. The whole time, God was at work, just beyond their experience, and they couldn't see it. But to their credit, they finally opened their eyes. And as we celebrate our 45th anniversary, I think about how important it has been to see how God is at work in our church, to see what God is doing. So we celebrate 45 years of faithfully pointing people to the real Jesus through word, through sacrament, and through authentically lived lives. And at the very beginning, there was some wrestling. Is this really the right thing to do? Is this really what God is calling us to do? Is God in this? And people have talked over and over again about Tom Holdike's conviction that Gig Harbor needed a non-creedal church, which is what Harbor Covenant is. It's a church that can focus on the gospel and not necessarily a list of doctrinal distinctives. And match that with Ernie, the first pastor, and his dedication to faithfully proclaiming the gospel. And it was a lot of work. It's a lot of work to plant a church, to do church in a box where you have to set everything up and tear everything down. The easy thing to do would have been to stay in Tacoma. It was a lot of work to plant a church in Gig Harbor. And I love the stories about people in the early years when they were meeting up at the mortuary, people who would come to visit. And after church, so many people told me, after church, Margaret Olson came up to me, welcomed me, handed me a vacuum cleaner, and said, "Go vacuum over there." Welcome to our community, find a place to serve. But there's all the setup and the tear down week after week after week. There was all the money that had to be given to start the ministry of the church and ultimately to buy property and to put buildings up and to provide for missions opportunities and to send missionaries and to send people in the church on missions. So this happened probably in the first year that I was here. And it's just kind of an illustration of how important missions have always been to our congregation. The student ministries was going on a mission trip, and they were $5,000 short of their goal. And there was a woman in the church named Audrey McBride. And everybody thought that Audrey was sweet, but I discovered she had a mean streak. Because Audrey got this idea in her head. She said, "We need $5,000. I will give she came to me. She's like, "I will give the $5,000 if you let us shave your head." And the picture has been shown several times this morning. You'll see it. So it was just important to be sending people on mission trips. So, I gave my hair for the cause. Lost my power at that point. But there's the faithful giving, that was a biblical joke for some of you. There's the faithful giving, the faithful serving, week in and week out, that enabled the church to meet its mission. From the very beginning, there was an interest in Christian formation and discipleship and really teaching people who Jesus was and having that impact their lives. There was an emphasis in classical spiritual disciplines. From the very beginning, there was a huge interest in children and student ministries so that young people would come to know Jesus and their families would come to know Jesus. Talked about missions. There was an interest in investing in the community and making a difference in Gig Harbor. And a real warmth and a welcome that people would remark about, a hospitality that was among us. And over the 45 years, or at least the 17 that I can speak to and the other stories that I have told, we have not tried to remake Jesus in our image. We've not tried to baptize our personal beliefs. We have tried to submit ourselves to the God who's revealed to us in the scriptures and in the sacraments and in lives faithfully lived for Jesus. We've believed that as individuals, our preferences might just be our preferences, and that we might be able to learn and grow when we love and respect and engage in conversation with people who love Jesus and maybe see things a little bit differently than we do. We've constantly believed in keeping the main thing the main thing. We've constantly believed that the message is up here, and that's what we need to focus on, not on the stuff that's down here that could so easily take our attention off what is most important. Over 45 years, we have navigated some trying times. And there have been any number of things we could have divided over, but we didn't. And I've become aware of how delicate and how precious our unity is. I've become aware that it really only takes one person to lose track of what's important. It only takes one person to choose their politics over the body of Christ. It really only takes one person on a mission that's even ever so slightly different to derail everything. And so it has been our task, and it is our task, to try to see, to try to perceive where God is at work. Because that's at the core of the story. God is always at work. We just have to open our eyes to see it. So particularly on this day, but I know that I have always done this, we celebrate what God has done in the past. And we're grateful for the people who have handed down the heritage that we have. But we're also excited for the new people that have come and are coming. While none of us knows the future, we know who holds the future. And I firmly believe that Harbor Covenant's most effective years, the best years for the kingdom of God, lie ahead. As long as we take the heritage that's been given to us and remember that the mission is up here, and that's where we need to keep the focus. Because there's no power in our doctrine. There's no power in our political views. There's no power in our economic theory. There is power in Jesus Christ, crucified, risen, ascended into heaven, coming again in victory to establish his kingdom. May we always be able to clearly see that. So let me ask you 3 questions. Number 1, is your view of Jesus informed more by the biblical account or your hopes and dreams? Number 2, how do your actions, priorities, your social media posts, and your conversations help people to see the real Jesus? And how can you help Harbor Covenant keep our focus squarely on proclaiming the gospel?